Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. The headlights of a parked car outside my home stayed on until I drew the curtains. It was an ordinary evening, just like any other. I had been sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed the car parked across the street. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I realized something odd. The headlights were on. Not just for a few minutes either. They had been shining brightly for what felt like hours, unmoving, unwavering. I tried to ignore it. I figured maybe the car had been left in some sort of malfunctioning mode, or maybe it was some careless driver who forgot to turn them off. But as time passed, something about the situation started to feel off. The car was still there, its headlights piercing the darkness outside. The street was quiet, unusually so, with not even a hint of movement. The car was the only thing that stood out. I got up from the couch, walking over to the window to take a better look. I peered through the blinds, trying to make out any details, but the headlights were blinding, making it impossible to see anything more than a silhouette. The car appeared to be an older model, its body dark and unremarkable, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. The longer I looked, the more I felt like the car was staring back at me, like it was waiting for something, or someone. My fingers gripped the edge of the curtains as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was late, and maybe I was just imagining things. I told myself to go back to what I was doing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I took a step back, then another, as though moving away from the window would make the car disappear. But it didn't. The headlights stayed on, cutting through the dark night like two unblinking eyes. I could feel my pulse quicken as a sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't the car itself that was bothering me, it was the way the headlights stayed on, like they were waiting for me to do something, or maybe waiting for something to happen. I couldn't take it anymore. I quickly crossed the room, grabbed the curtains, and yanked them closed, blocking out the view of the car. As the fabric covered the window, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The room felt suddenly quieter, calmer, as if the action had relieved the tension that had been building inside me. I returned to the couch, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort that clung to me. But even as I sat back down, I couldn't stop thinking about the car. What was it doing there? Why had the headlights stayed on for so long? And why did I feel like I was being watched? I couldn't explain it, but I knew that something was off. I tried to focus on my phone, hoping it would distract me, but every few minutes my eyes would drift toward the window where the car had been parked. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a random, inconsequential thing. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. An hour passed, and the car still hadn't moved. The headlights remained off, and the street outside had returned to its usual quiet state. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the car was still there, waiting for me to look again, waiting for me to open the curtains. By the time I finally managed to fall asleep that night, the car was still on my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the headlights glowing in the darkness. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But the more I thought about it, the less I could convince myself that it was nothing. The next morning, I woke up to an empty street. The car was gone. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more uneasy. The headlights, the strange stillness, the feeling that I had been watched, it all felt like something I couldn't explain. I went about my day trying to forget about it, but the memory lingered. Every time I walked past the window, I found myself glancing out toward where the car had been. I couldn't help but wonder, was it really gone, or had it just moved to a different spot? Maybe it was still watching, or maybe it had never left at all. Story 2. My name was etched into the frost on my car windshield when I went outside in the morning. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the first thing I noticed was the thick layer of frost covering the windshield. It was the kind of frost that formed intricate patterns, almost like a web of delicate, frozen flowers. But as I stepped closer, I saw something that made my heart race. There, clear as day, was my full name, carved into the ice. I froze, staring at it, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. I had parked the car the night before, and there had been nothing unusual when I locked it up. No one else had been around, at least not that I had noticed. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe the frost had formed in a way that just happened to look like my name. But that seemed ridiculous. The handwriting was too deliberate, too precise. It wasn't just a random pattern or coincidence. It was as if someone had taken the time to carve it in, slowly and carefully, as if they knew I would be the one to find it. I looked around the street, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, watching me, but there was no one. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses still dark as the morning sun struggled to rise. The feeling of unease crept over me. Who could have done this? Why would someone do this? I tried to convince myself that it was a prank, maybe from a neighbor or someone who had been playing a joke. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. It felt too personal, too unsettling. I brushed the frost off the windshield, the ice crunching beneath my fingers as I wiped away my name. The cold seeped into my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get rid of it. I started the car, trying to push the feeling of dread out of my mind. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overthinking it. But every time I glanced at the spot where my name had been etched, I felt the same tight knot in my stomach. Someone knew me. Someone was watching me. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus at work, my mind constantly drifting back to the incident with the car. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see that name written so clearly in the frost. I kept checking the windows, the locks, anything that might give me some reassurance that no one had been in my space. But everything seemed normal, too normal. When I returned home that evening, I felt a strange sense of relief as I pulled into my driveway. I was almost hoping the weirdness of the morning would stay in the past. But as I got out of the car and walked toward the door, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, just under the porch light, was a piece of paper wedged in the door. I picked it up cautiously, my hands trembling. The paper was simple, a plain white sheet with no return address. As I unfolded it, I felt a chill run through me. The message was brief, written in the same uneven handwriting I had seen on the frost earlier that day. "See you soon, a friend." The words were almost too much to process. My first thought was to laugh it off, to think that it was just another joke or some harmless prank from a friend. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. The handwriting matched. The message felt too deliberate. Someone knew something about me. Someone was out there, watching me, and I had no idea who it was or what they wanted. I turned around, scanning the empty street, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, waiting. But the neighborhood was silent, just like it had been earlier in the day. Still, the sense of unease hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I stuffed the note into my pocket, wondering if I was losing my mind or if this was something far darker than I was prepared to face. The next few days passed in a blur of tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was following me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking nearby, but there was never anyone there. And yet, the feeling never left me. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, keeping me on edge. I couldn't relax, couldn't focus. The thought that someone was out there, tracking me, waiting for the next step, consumed me. One morning, a few days later, I went out to my car again. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, and the frost on the windshield was thicker than usual. As I approached the car, my breath caught in my throat. The frost wasn't just on the windshield anymore. It was covering the entire front of the car, and in the center, in the same precise, deliberate handwriting, was my name once again. But this time, there was something else written underneath it. Ready for the game. I didn't know what to do. The note, the frost, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I didn't know where to start. I didn't know who was behind this, or what they wanted from me, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was playing a game with me, and whether I was ready or not, I was already a part of it. Story 3. It started in the morning. I had just finished breakfast when I heard the familiar knock on the door. I wasn't expecting any packages, but I figured maybe it was a mistake or a neighbor's delivery. When I opened the door, I was greeted by the same delivery person I'd seen a few times before. Tall, mid-40s, with a short cropped beard and a uniform that looked a little too tight around his shoulders. He smiled, but it seemed a bit forced. "Delivery for you," he said, glancing down at his clipboard as though double-checking something. I raised an eyebrow. "I'm not expecting anything." He paused for a moment, looking up at me with an almost apologetic look. "Oh, sorry. I must have gotten the address mixed up," he said quickly, his tone too rehearsed. "You have a nice day." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away. Confused, I closed the door, shaking my head. It was an odd exchange, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had just made a mistake. A couple of hours later, I was in the kitchen when I heard another knock. It was the same delivery person. Same expression. Same clipboard. This time, though, I noticed something different. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, staring at me for a second too long. I couldn't place it, something in his gaze felt off, as if he were trying to say something without actually saying it. "You again?" I asked, stepping back from the door, feeling a little uneasy. He looked down at his clipboard and mumbled, "Sorry, wrong address again," before quickly turning away and leaving. I stood in the doorway, watching him walk down the path. This time, something in the pit of my stomach told me this wasn't just a coincidence. By the time the sun was starting to set, I had forgotten about the earlier visits. That is, until I heard the knock for a third time. My heart sank. This wasn't normal. I walked cautiously to the door, my hand on the doorknob, unsure if I wanted to open it at all. I didn't even have to look through the peephole to know who it was. I opened the door slowly, my pulse racing, and there he was again, the same delivery person, standing just a little too close to the threshold. This time he didn't have his clipboard. No smile. No apology. He just stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I noticed how worn his uniform was, as if it had been the same one for far too long. "Is there a problem?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't say anything for a long time. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke in a quiet, almost inaudible voice. "I have something for you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I looked behind him, half expecting to see a package of some sort, but there was nothing. Just the empty space of my front porch. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling now. He blinked, almost like he had forgotten himself for a moment, then straightened up. "It's nothing. Sorry. I must have made a mistake again." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the street. I stood there, still holding the door open, my mind racing. 3 visits, no package, and the strange way he looked at me each time. I backed into the house and locked the door behind me, the sense of unease growing stronger. It wasn't just the oddity of the situation, it was the way he seemed to know exactly where I lived, how he never mentioned any other delivery, or even tried to explain what was happening. It felt wrong. Very wrong. I spent the rest of the evening checking every corner of my house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Each knock echoed in my mind, each visit left a lingering question that wouldn't go away. The next morning I received an email from the delivery service. It was a routine notification about a package being sent to my address, but the delivery date was days away. I clicked on the tracking number just to confirm, but the page didn't load. There was nothing. I wanted to forget about it all, but the memories of those 3 visits haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the delivery person wasn't just confused about addresses. There was something else, something more deliberate, and whatever it was, I hadn't seen the last of it. Story 4. It was a regular morning, the kind where I barely had the energy to get out of bed, but the thought of being late for work pushed me to hurry. I rushed through my routine, making coffee, grabbing a bagel, and stepping out the door with just enough time to catch the subway. The air was cold, biting at my skin as I rushed down the street, the familiar sights of my neighborhood almost comforting in their consistency. As usual, the subway was crowded, and I managed to squeeze into a car just before the doors closed. I stood by the pole, trying not to make eye contact with anyone, mindlessly scrolling through my phone to pass the time. But then I overheard something that made me freeze. 2 people were sitting a few seats away, chatting casually, but their conversation quickly caught my attention. One of them, a man with a deep voice, was describing someone's daily routine in detail. At first I didn't think much of it. People talk about their lives all the time, right? But as I listened, the description started to sound oddly familiar. "It's like she wakes up exactly at 6:30 every morning," the man said, his voice low but clear enough for me to hear. "She always starts her day with coffee, but not the regular kind. It's that fancy blend from the corner store, the one that's kind of expensive. Then she grabs something quick, like a bagel or some fruit, and heads out the door by 7:15. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked around the subway car, as if someone could have been watching me without my knowledge. But everyone seemed to be minding their own business, lost in their own thoughts or glued to their phones. The man continued, "She doesn't like to be late. She's always at the same spot on the platform, right by the exit. You'd think she was running late, but no, she's always there early. You know, she's always wearing that gray scarf, even on the warmer days. It's like she's attached to it." My heart began to race. My scarf, my routine, this person knew things about me. Too many things. But how? How could they possibly know? I was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I told myself. Maybe they were describing someone else. But the details, those were mine. They were my mornings, my habits. She gets on the train like clockwork, sits by the window, always with her earbuds in. It doesn't talk to anyone, the man continued, now sounding almost conspiratorial, like he was sharing a secret. And her stop always the same. Every single day without fail. Right after the park, just before the big intersection. My stomach dropped. I had just been in the park the day before. I had gotten off the subway right before that big intersection. This person, whoever they were, seemed to know exactly what I did every step of the way. I glanced around again, trying to spot anyone who might be watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was, that this conversation wasn't some strange coincidence but something intentional. The other person, a woman, laughed lightly. "You've been paying way too much attention to her. Maybe you should just talk to her instead of stalking her routine." The man chuckled, but his voice grew serious again. "I don't know. There's something about her, something off. I can't place it. It's like she's not even aware of how predictable she is. It's almost like she's being watched, but she doesn't know it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Watched. I could feel the weight of the phrase settle over me. Had someone been watching me without my knowing? Was this how it felt to be followed, to be observed from the shadows? The thought made my skin crawl. My daily routine, my little bubble of comfort, had become a subject of someone else's fascination. I had to get off the train. I had to get away from those people, away from the eyes that seemed to be fixed on me, even if they were miles away. But as I reached for the door to exit the subway car, I heard the man speak again, his voice carrying through the tense silence. "Maybe next week I'll take a different train and see if she still does the same thing. I wonder if she'll even notice I'm there." That was it. I couldn't stay on the subway a moment longer. I got off at the next stop, my heart pounding in my chest, and I rushed up to street level, taking deep breaths of the cold air. My legs felt unsteady as I walked down the sidewalk, but I couldn't stop the feeling that someone knew more about me than I should have ever allowed. The thought of someone tracking my every move, learning my routine, made me paranoid. It wasn't just the subway anymore. It was everywhere. Had I become a part of someone else's story without even knowing it? As I walked home, I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a bizarre coincidence, nothing more than a strange conversation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had become something that others were watching, studying, waiting for me to slip up, to notice them. And the idea of being invisible in my own life, watched without ever knowing, was the scariest thing I could imagine. Story 5. I had just returned home after a long day, eager to relax and unwind. The familiar creak of the door as it opened felt comforting, but as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was still, too still, and my senses immediately went into overdrive. I noticed it the moment I walked into the kitchen, the spare key. It sat on the counter, glistening under the dim light of the overhead bulb. The key was always kept hidden under the doormat outside, out of sight, out of reach. But now it was in plain view, right there on my kitchen counter. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, my mind racing. No one had been inside, or so I thought. I was sure of it. I hadn't told anyone about the spare key's location. I approached the counter slowly, almost hesitant, as if the key might somehow jump out at me and tell me everything I needed to know. It was the same key, I was sure of it. I recognized the small scratches on its surface, the worn edges from years of use. But how did it get there? I retraced my steps in my mind, trying to remember if I'd moved the key, if maybe I had misplaced it, or perhaps absent-mindedly taken it with me without realizing. But no, I hadn't touched it in weeks. I kept it under the mat because it was the one place I could guarantee it would be safe. No one would find it there, except now it was sitting out in the open. I walked over to it and picked it up, feeling the cold metal between my fingers. It felt oddly familiar, but it was also wrong. My hand trembled as I held it, and I could feel the back of my neck prickle with unease. Something wasn't right. I hadn't told anyone about the key. No one had been inside. Or had they? I quickly checked the rest of the house, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had crept over me. Everything seemed in its place except for the key. I checked the locks on the windows and doors. All of them were secure. But as I made my way through the rooms, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The silence was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I walked back to the counter, staring at the key again. It was too unsettling. The more I looked at it, the more certain I became that someone had been here. Someone had been inside my house while I was gone. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. But how? The locks were all intact. There were no signs of forced entry. Yet the key was on the counter, not under the mat where it was supposed to be. I felt my pulse quicken. Had I forgotten something? Could I have let someone in without realizing it? But there was no way. No one else had a key. It had been months since anyone had even visited. I turned to the door, scanning the hallway for any signs of a break-in. But nothing. Everything appeared to be normal, except for the key. That damned key. I paced the kitchen, my mind swirling with questions. Could someone have followed me? And could they have known about the spare key? But why move it? Why not just take it if they were inside already? Maybe they didn't want to steal anything. Maybe they just wanted to send a message. But what was the message? I took the key and moved back toward the mat outside. I crouched down and lifted it, almost as if expecting the world to make sense again. But nothing had changed. The spot was empty, just like it should be, just like it always was. No sign of anything unusual. And yet, the key was no longer under it. The mat, now lifted, seemed to echo the emptiness I felt in the pit of my stomach. It didn't make sense. I walked back inside, still holding the key in my hand. I had to figure this out. I had to understand what was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had moved the key, whoever had been inside, was still here. I wasn't alone. The thought gnawed at me as I locked the door behind me again, triple checking to make sure it was secure. The house felt too quiet, and that key sitting on the counter like a glaring reminder seemed to have its own message to deliver. But what? What did it mean? I went to my phone and started scrolling through my messages, my emails, anything that could explain why someone would come into my home. But there was nothing. No indication, no warning. No reason to suspect that anyone would know about the key or even care about it. I dropped onto the couch, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I closed my eyes, but the feeling didn't fade. It lingered, just like the key on the counter. It wasn't just about the key, it was about the fact that someone had been here, inside my house, with no sign of how or why. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever it was had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment. And for the first time, I wondered if I would ever feel safe in my own home again. Story 6. The moment I walked into my favorite coffee shop, the familiar hum of activity surrounded me, the soft chatter of customers, the hiss of the espresso machine, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. I smiled to myself as I approached the counter, knowing exactly what I wanted: a large dark roast with a splash of cream. The barista, Jenny, greeted me with her usual warmth as I placed my order, and I found a spot by the window, settling into the comfort of the place I'd come to consider a second home. As I sipped my coffee, I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The usual playlist was on in the background, soft indie tunes, a mix of soothing acoustic guitar and mellow beats. It was the perfect atmosphere for the morning, a routine I had come to rely on for the calm it provided in my otherwise chaotic life. Then, a song started playing. I didn't recognize it at first, the melody unfamiliar, but the lyrics caught me off guard. 2:30 on a Sunday on Maple Street. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I blinked, unsure if I had heard correctly. My mind raced, replaying the line over and over. Maple Street, that was my street. I hadn't heard the song before, but now it felt like the room had closed in on me. The song continued, the soft voice singing about things that felt too personal to be a coincidence. Dot house on the corner, white with blue shutters. That was my house, my exact house. The line wasn't generic, it was specific. It was describing my home. A chill crept up my spine as I looked around the room, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. The barista continued to prepare drinks. Customers chatted in the background, but everything felt distant, like I was no longer a part of the scene. My eyes darted toward the speaker near the ceiling, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing, but the words played on, too clear to ignore. Dot never thought I'd be here, but here I am, waiting by the door. I felt the blood drain from my face. The line about waiting by the door, it was as if the singer was describing my life, or worse, my very presence in that moment. Why would this song, of all songs, be playing in a coffee shop I frequented? And why were the lyrics so eerily familiar? It couldn't be a coincidence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a strange song with a bizarre set of lyrics, but deep down I knew that something wasn't right. I looked at Jenny, trying to act casual as she handed a cup to a customer nearby. She smiled and waved at me before turning back to her work, completely unaware of the unease that had taken over my thoughts. The song continued, the singer's voice now blending into the background of my mind as I tried to ignore the details I couldn't escape. My hands began to shake slightly as I gripped my coffee cup, the warmth doing little to calm my nerves. My mind raced through possible explanations. Had someone seen me at home recently? Had I somehow given away my address without realizing it? But no, I kept to myself. I didn't share personal details with anyone, and I certainly didn't broadcast where I lived. As the song wound down, I couldn't focus on anything else. The last line lingered in my mind, the final verse fading into nothingness, but the feeling didn't disappear. I left the coffee shop without finishing my drink, the doorbell chiming softly as I stepped into the cool air outside. My heart was still pounding, my mind too tangled to make sense of what had just happened. I told myself it was a strange coincidence, a random song with a coincidental set of lyrics. But as I walked down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there knew too much about me, someone who had been watching, waiting. When I got home, I checked my mail and my phone, hoping for some explanation, something to ground me back in reality. But there was nothing unusual. No new messages, no packages. It was as if the world had gone back to normal, but I couldn't erase the unease that lingered, especially now that I knew the song had been playing for a reason. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Who would know my address so specifically? And why use a song to get that message across? It felt like a sign, but from who? And what did they want from me? I couldn't get the song out of my head, the lyrics repeating in my mind with each passing hour. I had to know more. I had to find out where the song had come from, who had written it, and why it seemed to be so pointedly about me. The next morning, I returned to the coffee shop, determined to find answers. I asked Jenny about the song, trying to sound casual as I brought it up. "Hey, that song that was playing yesterday," I started, hesitating, unsure of how to ask without sounding insane. "Do you happen to know who it was by? It sounded really familiar." Jenny thought for a moment before shaking her head. I'm not sure, but I think it's from one of the playlists we've been using recently. It's a mix of some old and new stuff, pretty random. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of frustration. A playlist? It seemed so mundane, but it didn't make sense. A playlist couldn't just randomly contain a song with lyrics that matched my life so perfectly. I decided to leave it at that for now, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Later that night, I went online, searching for the lyrics I remembered. I found the song almost immediately. It was from an independent artist, someone I had never heard of before. The song had been released only a few months ago, and it had a very small following. I listened to it again, the words striking me with a renewed intensity. There it was in the chorus, the same lyrics. Maple Street. The house on the corner. Waiting by the door. It was all there, just like I had heard it at the coffee shop. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand how this artist knew details about my life, about my home. I didn't know how to feel about it anymore. But one thing was certain: the world felt smaller now, and I was no longer sure I could trust what I thought I could. Story 7. I had just come home from a long day at work, my mind too tired to focus on anything except the quiet comfort of my apartment. The dim lighting and the familiar hum of the fridge were the only sounds in the place as I set down my keys and kicked off my shoes. I didn't think much of it at first until I saw the note. It was thin, white paper, tucked just under the door. I hadn't heard anyone in the hallway, and there was no reason anyone should have been there. My stomach tightened as I crouched down and grabbed it, my fingers brushing against the cold paper. The writing was neat, almost clinical, but the message hit me like a punch. I can hear you breathe. I stood frozen for a moment, the words flashing in my mind as my heart began to race. The note didn't seem like something a prankster would leave. It was too precise, too unsettling. Who could have written this? Who had been here, listening to me? I glanced over my shoulder instinctively, as if expecting someone to be standing in the corner of my apartment watching me. But there was no one. The apartment was still, and the sounds of the building faint footsteps. The occasional creak of wood felt like they were a world away. I was alone. The note didn't say much, but it didn't need to. The implication was clear. Someone had been close. Someone had heard me breathe. The words were chilling, like an invisible presence in the room with me. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly shut the door behind me, locking it with a sense of urgency I hadn't felt before. I walked through the apartment, checking every corner, the bathroom, and even the closet, as though there might be someone hiding in the shadows. Of course, there wasn't. The apartment was empty, just as it had been when I left in the morning. But that note, it was a different story. It was too specific, too unnerving to be dismissed so easily. I set the note down on the kitchen counter, trying to think logically. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had delivered it to the wrong door by accident. But that didn't explain the words. Whoever had left it knew something. They knew I was alone. They knew I was here, now. I had been home for only a few minutes. The thought of someone standing outside my door, waiting for me to arrive, made my skin crawl. The idea that someone had been lurking, waiting for the exact moment I entered my apartment, left me feeling exposed. I grabbed my phone, deciding to call the building security, but then I stopped. I didn't even know where to start. What was I supposed to say? Someone left a note saying they can hear me breathe. They'd think I was crazy. I tried to push the feeling down, telling myself that maybe it was nothing, just some weird, harmless thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That voice in the back of my head was louder now, warning me that it was only the beginning. Later that evening, as I was trying to unwind, my phone buzzed on the table. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could stop myself, I opened it. The message was short. "I'm still listening." The breath in my lungs seemed to freeze. I stared at the words, my mind racing, my body tensed. Who could this be? My hands were shaking as I turned the phone over, like somehow doing so would stop the message from existing. I looked around my apartment again. The walls felt too close now, the air too thick. I hadn't heard any footsteps outside, hadn't heard any strange noises, nothing to indicate anyone was near me. But the message, it didn't need to be a phone call or a knock on the door to terrify me. The note had already proven that. This was different. It felt personal. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, couldn't stop the pit in my stomach from growing deeper with each passing second. The silence of my apartment seemed to press in on me, suffocating me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was right there, watching me from the shadows. I kept the light on in my bedroom, my phone close by, waiting for another message that never came. But the air in my apartment never felt quite the same again. The next morning I went to leave for work, and once again I found a note under my door. I didn't have to open it to know what it said. The familiar, tight feeling in my chest returned, and I stood there, staring at the paper, my fingers frozen just above it. But this time the note was different. It wasn't just the simple phrase one had been expecting. This one said, "You're not safe here." And for the first time since I moved into this apartment, I felt that strange, suffocating fear, one that told me I wasn't just paranoid. The words weren't just a warning anymore. They were a promise. Something was coming. Someone was already here, waiting for me to let my guard down. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Story 8. I had been working late again, the soft click of my keyboard the only sound in the dimly lit office. The hours were blending together, and my mind was beginning to feel like it was stuck in a fog. I rubbed my eyes, trying to push through the exhaustion that weighed down on me. My office was a small, quiet room with stacks of paperwork and files strewn across every available surface. I was used to the mess, but tonight, everything felt overwhelming, like the clutter was closing in on me. I hadn't planned on working late, but it had been one of those days where everything seemed to drag, and I needed to catch up. I'd lost track of time, and now the only thing left on my to-do list was to finish a report I had been procrastinating on for days. I took a deep breath, focusing on the task in front of me, when something caught my eye. A dark shape leaning against the door. It was familiar, yet completely out of place. I hadn't seen it in weeks, and yet there it was, propped up against the doorframe. My umbrella. I blinked, unsure whether I was seeing things. I had lost the umbrella weeks ago, or at least I thought I had. I remember exactly when I last used it. It was a rainy evening, and I'd been running late to a meeting. I had grabbed it from the coat rack, rushed out the door, and didn't even think twice. But after I got back home, I realized I had left it behind, somewhere. I searched everywhere. I checked the parking garage, retraced my steps, and even asked my colleagues if they had seen it. But no one had, and I gave up. The umbrella had simply disappeared. Now there it was, standing against the door like it had been placed there deliberately. My mind raced. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't been to the office in days, and the umbrella certainly wasn't there the last time I left. I hadn't even thought about it since then, so how had it ended up in my office, propped up as though it had always been there. I stood frozen for a moment, my eyes locked on the umbrella. It looked exactly the same dark blue, slightly worn around the edges from the rain, the handle smooth from use. There was no mistaking it. But the question gnawed at me: how had it gotten here? I hesitated, then slowly walked toward the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through my fingers. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, silent, and as dark as it always was at this hour. I stepped out, glancing around, but everything seemed normal. The other offices were locked, the lights off, and the faint hum of the building's air conditioning echoed down the hall. I looked back at the umbrella, still leaning against my door, and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I took a few steps forward, looking over my shoulder to make sure I was alone. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and lifeless. I could almost hear my heart beat in the silence. It didn't feel right. There was something unsettling about the whole situation, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I picked up the umbrella and turned it over in my hands, as though examining it might somehow explain its sudden appearance. But there was no explanation. No note, no sign that anyone had left it here. It was as if it had just materialized out of thin air. I closed the door behind me and took the umbrella back to my desk. My thoughts were scattered, racing through every possible explanation, none of which made sense. Had someone been in my office when I wasn't here? Was it some kind of prank? But the idea that someone could have gotten in without my knowledge, without leaving any trace behind, made my skin crawl. I set the umbrella down beside my desk, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things because of the late hour. But then I remembered something else, something that only made the situation feel worse. The last time I had used that umbrella, I had left the office in a rush. The meeting had run late, and I was already running behind schedule. I remember grabbing the umbrella, leaving my office with a sense of urgency, not paying attention to anything around me. I had been so focused on getting to the meeting that I hadn't even noticed anything strange, anything out of the ordinary. But now, looking at it, I realized that I had never brought it back to my office. I had left it in the car or in the hallway, right? No, that didn't make sense. I had searched for it everywhere when I noticed it was missing and I hadn't found it. I had given up, chalking it up to being lost forever. And yet here it was, as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't let it go. My mind kept circling back to the same question: how had it gotten here? It was as though someone had deliberately placed it by my door, like they had known I would come back and find it. But who? I got up from my desk and walked around the office again, checking the windows and the door, making sure everything was locked. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But when I turned to look behind me, there was no one there. I glanced back at the umbrella on my desk. It seemed innocent enough, just a simple object. But I couldn't escape the eerie sense that it was connected to something I didn't understand, something I hadn't noticed before. I decided to leave for the night, hoping that a change of scenery would calm my nerves. As I grabbed my things and turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The umbrella wasn't where I had left it. It was gone. I looked around the room, my pulse racing. The desk was as cluttered as ever, but the umbrella was nowhere to be found. I checked the floor, the shelves, even the chair. Nothing. It had disappeared. Panic surged through me. It was as if the umbrella had never been there, as if it had never existed at all. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my breath shallow, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. I checked my phone, hoping for some distraction, anything to pull me out of the growing dread. There were no new messages, no missed calls. But when I went to check the time, I froze again. The time on my phone was hours ahead. I had left the office only a few minutes ago, but somehow hours had passed. It was as if time had warped, twisted, and slipped away from me without me noticing. I tried to steady myself, but the feeling of something being wrong, of something just out of reach, hung in the air like a heavy fog. I looked back at the door, half expecting the umbrella to reappear, but it was gone, just like everything else that didn't make sense. The only thing I was left with was the haunting question: how had it gotten here? And where had it gone? Story 9. Ain. It was a quiet afternoon when I received the message. I had just finished my lunch and was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, checking the usual social media updates, when the text popped up. The notification blinked on the screen, a new message from an unknown number. "I like your sweater." I stared at the words for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't the message that confused me, it was the fact that I was sitting in my apartment alone, wearing an old, oversized sweater that I hadn't worn out in weeks. I didn't remember posting a picture of it anywhere, nor had I shared anything with anyone recently about what I was wearing. The message was casual, almost complimenting me, but it felt wrong. Why would someone message me like that? I glanced at the contact number. It was unfamiliar, a string of digits that didn't match anyone I knew. I furrowed my brow, trying to think. Maybe it was a mistake. A random number sending a message to the wrong person. But how would they know about my sweater? I hadn't been out today, and I hadn't shared any recent pictures of myself. I debated whether or not to respond. My first instinct was to ignore it, to block the number and move on with my day. But something nagged at me, curiosity, I suppose. Was it someone I knew playing a prank on me? I felt a chill run through me as I thought about it. I didn't like the idea of someone watching me, even if it was just a harmless joke. I had no reason to think anyone was following me, but the thought still made my skin crawl. I decided to text back, trying to brush off the unease that was starting to settle in my chest. "Who is this?" I typed out, hitting send without a second thought. I figured if it was a prank or a mistake, the person would clarify quickly. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The little bubbles popped up for a second, then paused, as if the person was typing back. My eyes stayed glued to the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, ready to respond if needed. After a few moments, the bubbles stopped. No new text came through. I glanced at my phone, almost expecting the conversation to continue, but it didn't. My mind began to race. The silence was unsettling. Why hadn't they replied? Why would someone send me a message and then leave me hanging? I checked the time, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual sound of traffic outside, the occasional honk, the hum of my fridge in the kitchen. Yet the air in my apartment felt thick, suffocating. I stared at the screen again, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Who would send such a random message with no context? I thought about the sweater again, the one I was wearing. It wasn't anything special, just a faded green knit that I kept around for comfort. Nothing that anyone would remember, unless they'd been in my apartment recently. I quickly glanced around the living room. The door was locked. The windows were closed. I had no reason to feel paranoid, but that creeping sense of unease wouldn't go away. It was almost as if the message had opened a door I hadn't expected, one I couldn't quite close. The phone buzzed suddenly, breaking me from my thoughts. A new message appeared from the same unknown number. I hope you're comfortable. Way. I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. How could they know how I was feeling right now? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. No one else was in my apartment. I hadn't told anyone what I was doing, and yet someone seemed to know more than they should. I quickly checked the room again, just to be sure. There was nothing out of place. The blinds were still drawn, the kitchen was quiet, and the hallway outside my door remained still. But the message was impossible to ignore. The person knew something they shouldn't. I sat there for a while, unsure of what to do. Should I block the number? Should I call someone? I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? A stranger sent me a message about my sweater. It seemed absurd. And then the phone buzzed again. I saw you. The words were short, chilling, and sent a wave of panic rushing through me. My breath caught in my throat, and my mind went blank. I hadn't seen anyone, no one had come to my door, no one had knocked, and I hadn't been outside. But the message said otherwise. My hands trembled as I held the phone, my eyes locked on the screen. I saw you, it said, and for a moment, I wondered if I was imagining it. But I wasn't. It was real. Someone was watching me. I stood up, pacing the apartment in a desperate attempt to shake off the feeling of being trapped. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone had seen me through the window. Maybe a neighbor had mistaken me for someone else. But that didn't explain the detail in the messages. How could anyone know what I was wearing or what I was doing in the apartment if they weren't here? The phone buzzed again. I hesitated before reading it. I'm right here. The message didn't come with any other context, no explanation. It just hung there. The words seemed to vibrate with a sense of threat, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I dropped the phone onto the couch, standing still for a moment, my mind spinning. I wanted to scream, to shout at whoever was sending these messages, but I couldn't. I couldn't even move. It felt like hours passed, though I knew it had only been minutes. The weight of the situation hung over me, suffocating. I felt as though I was waiting for something, waiting for the moment when I would finally understand what was happening. Was it a prank? A mistake? Or was someone truly watching me? I didn't know what to do next. Should I leave? Should I call someone? The messages had stopped, but I still felt that cold sense of being watched, as though eyes were on me from the darkness of my apartment. I turned to look around the room once more, scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing seemed out of place, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next step was clear. I had to leave. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket, bolting out of the door. As I turned to lock it behind me, I glanced at my phone one last time. There, on the screen, was a final message. Don't come back. And for the first time, I truly feared what was happening. Story 10. It was an ordinary evening, nothing out of the usual. I had just finished a long day of work and was looking forward to a quiet night at home. After a quick dinner, I decided to take a shower to unwind. The bathroom was warm and steamy as the hot water from the shower filled the space with fog. I didn't pay much attention to the mirror when I stepped out of the shower, wiping away the mist with my hand as I went about my usual routine. But then I stopped. The mirror, which I had wiped clear just minutes earlier, now had something written on it. I stood frozen, staring at the words scrawled across the foggy surface. It wasn't written in the usual way someone might use a finger to draw. No, this was different. The word soon was written deliberately in toothpaste, smeared in thick, uneven strokes. The words stood out against the foggy glass. A message that felt out of place, like it didn't belong. I was stunned. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten to clean the mirror after brushing my teeth, but that didn't make sense. I had just been in there. I would have noticed. I ran my fingers over the word, feeling the smooth paste left behind, but there was no way I could have done it myself and not remembered. It was so clear, so intentional, and it unnerved me. My mind raced. I was alone. There was no one else in the apartment. No one else could have written it. I turned in circles, trying to think of an explanation, but nothing came to mind. I wasn't the type to get paranoid, but this felt wrong. Who had written this, and why? I wiped the mirror clean again, hoping it was just a bizarre mistake. But as I rubbed the surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was as if the word was lingering there, pressing against me from all angles. I glanced at the bathroom door, the corners of the room. Everything was quiet, the silence almost oppressive. I took a deep breath and tried to focus. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe it was just my own mind playing tricks on me. The word was so simple just soon. It didn't make sense to read too much into it, right? But then it hit me I hadn't used the toothpaste that night. I was careful to avoid it after I brushed my teeth earlier, leaving it on the counter. I hadn't even touched it. The toothpaste was still there, untouched on the edge of the sink. I wiped the mirror again, this time frantically, but the word soon was still there, as clear as before. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message for me, something I wasn't understanding. I left the bathroom, my pulse quickening. The strange sensation stayed with me, following me through the house. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept darting back to the bathroom door, as if something was waiting for me in there. The word soon was burned into my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept thinking about the message. Was it a warning? Was something going to happen soon? The thought crept into my mind, unsettling me further. I knew it was ridiculous, just a weird coincidence, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed. The next morning, I decided to get on with my day. I was determined not to let it affect me, so I got ready and headed out for errands. But even as I left the apartment, I kept feeling that strange weight of the word following me. When I returned, everything seemed normal. The apartment was quiet, just like when I left. I stepped into the bathroom again, half expecting to see something else. To my relief, the mirror was clear, the toothpaste gone. But that didn't make the unease go away. The words soon kept echoing in my mind. Days went by, and I convinced myself it had been a weird, one-off occurrence. I tried to forget about it, but there were times when I'd be doing something simple, like brushing my teeth, and I'd feel like something was off. That word, that single word, was always there, hovering in the back of my mind. Then, one night, something happened. I was getting ready for bed, walking past the bathroom mirror when I stopped short. The bathroom light flickered, and for a split second, I saw something else in the reflection. I couldn't quite make it out, but it looked like a shadow, or maybe a figure, standing behind me. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I stared at the bathroom door. It had been a long day and I was exhausted, but there was something about the way the light flickered that felt wrong. I stepped into the bathroom, cautiously, and looked into the mirror. There, etched into the glass, was something new. The word soon had been joined by another word soon. It's happening. I froze. My hands trembled as I leaned in closer, but before I could reach out to wipe it away, the light flickered again, and the words began to blur, as if something invisible was pushing against the glass. I backed away, my breath shallow, and turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. Panic surged through me. I pulled on the handle again, harder this time, but it wouldn't budge. I ran to the window, but there was no escape. The sense of being trapped grew stronger, more suffocating with every passing second. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything. What did soon mean? Why was it in the mirror? Was I being targeted by someone? Was it a prank? I kept hearing a faint scratching sound behind me, as though someone or something was trying to get in. The door creaked again, this time louder, as if something heavy was moving against it. I turned, but nothing was there. The room was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. Then, suddenly I heard a voice, low and calm, whisper from behind me. "Soon." And that's when I knew. The word was a warning. Whatever had been happening, whatever was coming, it was closer than I had realized. Story 11. I found an old train ticket in my wallet for a journey I never took. The edges were worn, a little frayed, and the colors on the ticket were faded. It didn't look like something I would typically keep, yet there it was, tucked neatly between the folds of my wallet, as though it had always been there. I stared at it, confused. I didn't remember buying it. I didn't remember any train journey at all. It wasn't even for a route I recognized. The ticket was dated several weeks ago, but I hadn't traveled anywhere recently, especially not by train. My routine had been mundane, filled with work and home responsibilities. So why was this ticket in my wallet? I turned it over in my hands, inspecting it more closely. It was for a train heading to a destination I had never heard of, a small town several hundred miles away. I couldn't even recall seeing the name of this place before. It looked foreign to me. I checked the ticket again, searching for more details. There was a time listed for departure, but it didn't match anything on any train schedule I could recall. I had no memory of purchasing the ticket, nor any memory of being anywhere near the train station. The further I stared at it, the more I realized how wrong it all felt. Something about the ticket felt off. The type F, the way the edges were frayed as if it had been handled a lot. Even though I had never seen it before, it was all unsettling. I thought back to the past few weeks, trying to piece together where I could have been, what I could have been doing. I hadn't gone on any trips. My days had been spent at home, my work scattered across my desk, my usual routines playing on repeat. I didn't remember leaving the city, and I certainly didn't remember buying a train ticket for a trip to somewhere I didn't recognize. I shoved the ticket back into my wallet, trying to ignore the growing unease that bubbled up inside me. Maybe it was just a mistake, some forgotten purchase, a ticket from a trip I had intended to take but never did. I couldn't come up with any other explanation, so I decided to forget about it. But the ticket wouldn't let me. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly thinking about it. Every time I opened my wallet to pay for something, I saw it staring back at me. It felt like it had become part of my life, like it belonged there. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized I couldn't get rid of it. I tried to throw it away, but every time I reached for the trash, I hesitated. What if it meant something? What if it was trying to tell me something I wasn't seeing? The feeling of dread grew with each passing day. I began to second-guess every part of my routine, wondering if I had missed something crucial. And could I have taken the train without realizing it? Could I have boarded it in a daze, not knowing where I was going? I tried to remember any odd details from the days surrounding the date on the ticket, but nothing came to mind. It was as though that time had been wiped from my memory entirely. Then, a few days later, I found something else that deepened my confusion. I was cleaning my bedroom when I came across a receipt buried beneath a stack of old magazines. It was for a cafe near the train station mentioned on the ticket. I didn't recall ever visiting that cafe, but the receipt was clear as day, dated the same day as the train ticket. I had no memory of buying anything from that cafe. In fact, I had no memory of being near that station at all. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. How could this be? How was it possible that I had no memory of a journey I supposedly took? The ticket, the receipt, they seemed connected, yet I couldn't recall a single moment from either. I looked at the ticket again, the printed time of departure staring up at me, and something inside me snapped. I had to know what happened. The next morning, I decided to visit the train station. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but something told me that the answers might be there, hidden in the places I hadn't thought to look. I walked through the bustling station, trying to retrace my steps, but everything felt unfamiliar. It was as if I had never been here before, yet the memories of the ticket and the receipt clung to me like a shadow. I approached the ticket counter, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hi," I said, trying to sound normal, though I felt anything but. "I'm wondering if you have any records of a journey I might have taken a few weeks ago." The clerk looked at me, her expression blank. "What's the date of the ticket?" she asked. I handed her the ticket, my fingers trembling. She typed something into her computer and then paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. "There's no record of this ticket in our system," she said, her voice tight. "It shouldn't be possible for someone to have a ticket and no record of the journey." I stared at her, my mind racing. "But I have the ticket. It's in my wallet, right here. I didn't make this up." She looked at the ticket again, her expression neutral, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. "There's no trace of this ticket. Are you sure you didn't purchase it online or from a third-party vendor? We don't show anything matching this in our records." I shook my head, feeling the world spin around me. How could this be happening? How could I have a ticket for a journey that didn't exist? I had no answers, no explanations. Just a train ticket, a receipt, and the strange, gnawing sensation that I was losing my grip on reality. I left the station, the weight of the ticket still in my wallet, still pressing against me like an unanswered question. Where had I gone? Why didn't I remember it? What had happened to the time I had supposedly spent on that train? I had no answers, only questions that deepened with each passing hour. The ticket remained in my wallet, the mystery lingering. No matter how much I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to remember something, a journey I had taken, or perhaps one that had never happened at all. Story 12. My shoes had fresh mud on the soles, though I hadn't left the house all day. I had spent the entire morning cleaning, organizing, and catching up on work in the comfort of my home. There was no reason for mud to be on my shoes. I hadn't even stepped outside. But there it was, unmistakable and thick, caked on the soles, as if I had trudged through a muddy field or a rain-soaked street. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the evidence, my mind trying to piece together what had happened. I leaned down, inspecting the mud closely. It was dark and wet, and it smelled faintly of earth, a damp, pungent scent that immediately set my nerves on edge. I didn't recognize it, didn't recall walking anywhere that could leave such a mess. I had worn these shoes all day, hadn't taken them off until now. My first instinct was to check the door, to see if someone had come in without me knowing, but the door was locked, just like I had left it. There was no sign of anyone else in the house. I stood up slowly, looking around the room, my eyes scanning for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. But that mud, those muddy shoes remained, an unexplained detail that gnawed at me. I wiped them off with a rag, trying to focus on something else. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the question that lingered in my mind: how did the mud get there? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how impossible it was for anyone to have come inside. I had been home all day. The blinds were closed and the windows were locked. No one could have entered without me noticing. And yet, here I was, standing with muddy shoes, holding the proof that something or someone had been in my space without me knowing. I retraced my steps throughout the day, trying to figure out when I could have stepped into mud without realizing it. But every moment, every movement had been inside my house. I hadn't left. I didn't even open the windows. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend or a neighbor, to ask if they had seen anything strange, but the thought of sounding paranoid made me hesitate. I didn't want to seem crazy, even if it felt like something was off. That evening, as I sat in the living room, my mind kept racing. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself I was overthinking, but the feeling of unease only grew. The mud, the mystery of how it got there, lingered like a shadow in my thoughts. As night fell, I made sure the doors were locked, the windows secured, and every light was turned off, just to be safe. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. As I stepped out of bed and into the hallway, I froze. My shoes, the same ones from yesterday, were in the same place I had left them, but they were caked in fresh mud again. This time, the mud was even thicker, more pronounced, as if someone had purposely walked through a wet field before coming inside. I felt my heart race as I stared at the shoes, wondering how they had gotten this way. I hadn't gone outside. No one else had been in the house. I picked up the shoes, my hands trembling, and walked over to the door. I checked the locks once more, hoping to find some explanation, some sign that someone had entered while I was asleep. But the door was locked, the windows secure, just like they had been the night before. There was no way in, no way for anyone to have left the mud on my shoes. Panic began to rise in my chest, the unease turning into something more tangible. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities. Could someone have been in the house while I slept? But that seemed impossible. I would have heard something, noticed something. The silence was deafening, the stillness of the house suffocating. I tried to tell myself it was just a fluke, that I was imagining things, but the muddy shoes, fresh and undeniable, stared back at me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, and I had no idea what it was. I called a locksmith, hoping they could offer some kind of solution, some way to explain how this was happening. When the locksmith arrived, I showed him the shoes and explained everything: the mud, the locked doors, the empty house. He looked puzzled but agreed to inspect the locks, checking every window and door carefully. After a while, he shrugged, unable to find anything out of the ordinary. He suggested that maybe I had forgotten going outside, maybe I had stepped in the mud without realizing it. But his words didn't reassure me. I knew what I had seen. I hadn't left the house. I was certain of it. That night I sat up late, watching the clock tick by as the house remained eerily quiet. I checked the locks again, checked the windows, checked everything as though I could somehow find an explanation, a way to make sense of the madness. But there was nothing. No one had come in, and yet the mud was still there. It was as if the world had shifted, as if something had changed overnight. I didn't know what to do, where to turn. The feeling of being watched, of being stalked, was growing stronger with every passing hour. The next day, as I walked into the hallway, I looked at my shoes once more. There was no mud this time, but the emptiness in the house was suffocating. I had no answers, no explanations, and the sense of dread was so overwhelming I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Whoever or whatever had left the mud on my shoes had made their presence known, and I couldn't escape it. Story 13. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I stepped out to get the mail. The air was cool, with a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the trees along the street. I barely paid attention to the usual neighborhood sounds, the distant hum of cars, birds chirping. As I reached for the mailbox, I noticed my neighbor across the street standing at the end of his driveway, waving enthusiastically at me. "Hey," he called, a big grin on his face. That was quite the party last night. I froze for a moment, confusion seizing me. Party? I had been asleep by 9 p.m. the previous night, exhausted from a long week of work. There was no party, no guests, no noise. The house was quiet, the lights turned off long before midnight. What do you mean?" I asked, still trying to wrap my head around what he was implying. My voice must have sounded a little uncertain because his grin faltered for just a second. "You know, the music, the people, lots of people," he said, giving me a wink like it was some sort of inside joke. "You sure know how to throw a good time." I glanced over at my house, then back at him, still unable to process his words. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was asleep. There was no party." He looked taken aback for a moment, then shrugged as if he hadn't really thought it was a big deal. "Oh well, maybe I was just hearing things," he said with a casual laugh. "It sounded like you were having a blast." I tried to push the conversation away, feeling a creeping unease in my chest. Maybe it was a mix-up, maybe he'd confused my house with someone else's. But something about his certainty, the way he spoke as if it were completely normal, sent a shiver down my spine. The next morning I couldn't shake the thought of his words. Quite the party last night. I kept replaying the sentence in my mind. I even walked around my house, checking to see if I had somehow missed something, a spilled drink, some sign of a celebration. But nothing. The house was just as I had left it, empty, quiet and undisturbed. I decided to confront a couple of other neighbors, hoping they could offer some clarity. But each one, without fail, said the same thing. "We heard the music, the laughter. You guys really know how to throw a party." They described the sounds I'd supposedly been a part of, the laughter, the music, the distant chatter. Yet, I knew none of it had happened. It wasn't until later that day, when I checked my security cameras, that the full weight of it all hit me. I didn't recognize the footage. The timestamp was from the night before, around the time I had been fast asleep. There on the video was the unmistakable sight of a crowd outside my house laughing, dancing, music blaring from speakers I didn't own. And the strangest part, my front door was wide open, like I had invited them in. But I hadn't. I never did. The footage went on for hours, the chaos slowly dying down in the early morning. People walked away, some with drinks in their hands, others still laughing. And then it was silent again. I felt my stomach twist. I hadn't opened the door to anyone, hadn't let anyone inside. Yet the camera footage clearly showed a party I hadn't attended. I checked again, but there was no evidence of anyone leaving, just the sound of people coming, the noise of celebration, and the emptiness once it was over. I locked the doors and turned off all the lights in the house, but I still felt exposed, vulnerable, like I had lost control of something I never even knew was happening. What was worse, no one else seemed concerned. They all talked about it like it was a normal occurrence, as if my participation in it was a given. I kept asking myself, who were those people? How did they get in? And why did none of them seem to remember anything when I asked about it? Story 14. It had been one of those days, busy, exhausting, and filled with the usual stress of deadlines and responsibilities. I barely had time to eat, let alone think about the little things. By the time I finished work and started packing up, the office was nearly empty, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the quiet space. I was looking forward to heading home, to finally shutting down after a long day. As I gathered my things, I glanced over at my desk. The small plant that sat in the corner was the only thing I kept there for comfort. It was a simple thing, just a few small green leaves, but it had been with me for months, and I took pride in keeping it alive. I always made sure it got watered, even if I had to do it quickly between meetings. But as I looked at it now, something was different. The plant had been moved slightly. The pot was no longer exactly where I had left it, and it was facing a different direction. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe I had bumped it earlier without realizing. But then I noticed something else. There was a small puddle of water in the saucer beneath the pot. The plant had been watered. I froze. I hadn't touched it. In fact, I distinctly remembered the last time I watered it. It had been earlier in the week, and I'd made a mental note to do it again tomorrow. There was no way it could have been watered since then. I glanced around the room. There was no one left in the office. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until the morning, and they certainly wouldn't have watered my plant or moved it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the plant, my mind racing. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I had someone come into my office when I wasn't around. But why? Why would anyone touch my plant? And how could they have done it without me noticing? I would have heard footsteps or seen someone walking past. I didn't hear anything. There had been no knock on the door, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the plant. It was heavier than I expected, like it had absorbed more water than it should have. The soil felt damp, almost soaked. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Whoever had done this hadn't just moved it, they had taken the time to water it too, even though I never told anyone to. I checked the windowsill, looking for any evidence that someone might have come in through the window, but it was locked, the blinds drawn tight. I scanned the room again, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no explanation. No one had touched my plant, at least not when I had been here. The only other explanation was, someone had been in here while I wasn't looking. The idea lingered, and I couldn't shake it. Who would have done this? Was it a joke? A prank from one of my colleagues? Or was it something more sinister, someone silently watching, waiting for the right moment to invade my space, my routine? I grabbed my bag and headed out the door, my thoughts racing. The strange feeling of being watched stayed with me, clinging to me like a shadow. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But something about that plant, so carefully watered and moved without my knowledge, made it impossible to let go of the thought. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mind kept returning to that strange moment in the office, the way the plant had been moved, the way it had been watered. There was no logical explanation for it, but the feeling of unease grew stronger with every passing hour. I went to bed that night, tossing and turning, my mind racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone creeping into my office, watching me when I wasn't there, touching things that didn't belong to them. But most of all, I couldn't stop thinking about that plant, the simple, innocent thing that had been watered and moved. Had someone really been in my space, or was I just losing my mind from the pressure of work? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that the next morning, as I walked into the office, I would check that plant again. And if it had been moved, if it had been watered once more, I would have to face the uncomfortable truth I was not alone. Story 15. I jolted awake, the sharp sound of my alarm pulling me out of a deep sleep. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It was still dark outside. My phone, usually set to a gentle, familiar tone, was buzzing incessantly. Confused, I reached for it and saw the screen flash with a notification: time to go. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize the label. I never set an alarm like that. My alarms were always labeled with things like wake up or morning routine, simple reminders for the start of the day. But this, time to go, the phrase felt unsettling, like a command. My hands felt cold as I unlocked the phone, wondering if I'd set it accidentally, or if perhaps someone else had tampered with it. But I knew for sure that I hadn't. I quickly checked the alarm settings. There it was, an alarm scheduled for 4:30 a.m. set with that bizarre label. The time was now 4:30 a.m. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen. I had no memory of setting this alarm. I never set alarms this early, and certainly not with a label like that. The only thing I had planned for the morning was a work meeting at 9:00. So why had my phone just woken me up at this strange time? I tried to convince myself it was just some glitch, some strange bug in the system. But as I sat up in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was quiet, too quiet. The air felt heavy, like a presence was lingering just outside my reach. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up, my feet cold against the floor. I didn't want to go back to sleep. I had this eerie sense that something was waiting for me if I did. I checked the windows and doors just to be sure. Everything was locked, secure. But still, the strange alarm lingered in my mind. It wasn't just the time, it was the message. Time to go. Go where? I grabbed a glass of water, trying to shake off the tension that seemed to tighten around me. But the more I thought about it, the more the words rattled in my mind. What if someone had set this alarm? Someone who knew me well enough to change things without me realizing. It wasn't beyond the realm of possibility. I had a few people in my life who knew my phone password, though I hadn't seen or spoken to them in a while. But this felt different. It wasn't just an alarm. It was a message. I opened my phone again and scrolled through my recent messages. Nothing stood out. No strange contacts, no new alerts. I checked my calendar. The same nothing unusual. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. My phone had never done something like this before. I had no idea how this alarm got there, but I couldn't ignore the sense of foreboding that followed it. I went back to the alarm settings, hoping I could at least turn it off. But as I tapped on the alarm to edit it, my phone froze. A simple black screen stared back at me. I tried again. Nothing. Panic began to rise in my chest. I wasn't the most tech-savvy person, but I knew enough to recognize that something was wrong. I turned the phone off and on again, but when it powered up, the alarm was still there, still set for the same time, with the same eerie label. Time to go. I felt trapped, unable to do anything to remove it. What was happening? Why was this happening? It was just an alarm, something trivial, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some technical malfunction. It was almost as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me. But what did it want? I sat back down on the bed, the weight of unease pressing on my chest. I kept thinking of all the possible explanations, running through every scenario in my head. But no matter what I came up with, nothing seemed to make sense. I hadn't set that alarm. No one else should have access to my phone. And yet there it was, a reminder to go. Go where? I pulled the covers tightly around me, trying to push the fear aside. But I couldn't. I kept thinking about the words. Time to go. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room again. Everything was still, everything in its place, but the sense of something unseen, Something just out of reach filled the space. The house felt too quiet now. The silence felt like it was closing in, like I was being watched. I glanced at the clock again. The time was now 4:45 a.m. I stood up and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly to see outside. The street was empty, the same as it always was at this hour. There was nothing out there. Nothing that could explain the sudden sense of dread that had taken over me. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Time to go. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if it was a warning, a message, or something else entirely. All I knew was that my phone had somehow given me an order, and I had no idea what it wanted me to do next. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel safe in my own home. Something had shifted. Something had changed. And it was clear that whatever was behind this strange alarm wasn't done yet. Story 16. I had been sitting on the couch for what felt like hours, scrolling through my phone, trying to unwind after a long day. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was one of those moments where everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had just made a cup of tea, the warmth of the mug in my hands offering a small comfort, when I glanced toward the living room window. It was slightly open, and I froze. The window had been closed for weeks. I knew it. I was certain of it. I never opened it, there was no reason to. The weather had been cold recently, and I preferred to keep the house sealed tight against the chill. But there it was, the window, cracked just enough for a faint breeze to slip inside. My heart began to race as I set my tea down, getting up to move closer. I reached out to push the window closed, my fingers brushing against the cold glass. That's when I noticed something else. The latch, the one that should have been secure, locking the window in place, wasn't engaged. It was undone, but I had never left it like that. I would have remembered. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I had opened it at some point without remembering, though that didn't feel right. I didn't like the idea of the window being open at all, especially at this hour, when the night felt unnaturally still. It wasn't just about the window, it was the feeling it gave me. The sense that someone else had been here, that the space wasn't as safe and private as I had thought. I checked the rest of the room, scanning for any other signs of disturbance. The furniture was where I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I walked over to the front door, checking the lock. It was secure. The other windows in the house, which I knew I hadn't opened, were all still tightly shut. Yet the living room window remained open. I stood there for a few moments, wrestling with the urge to go outside and check the area around the house. What if someone had been watching me? What if someone had gotten inside while I wasn't paying attention? I quickly dismissed the thought, trying to rationalize. No, the window wasn't fully open. It couldn't have been used to enter the house. But then how had it been undone? How had I missed something so simple? I pushed the window all the way shut, the soft click of the latch echoing in the stillness. I stood there for a while, wondering if I was overthinking things. I often did that, let my mind wander to darker places when it should have been focused on something else. Still, the question lingered in my mind, had I really forgotten about it, or had someone else been inside? I decided to lock the window, even though it already felt secure. I didn't want to leave anything to chance, and the thought of someone getting in through an unlocked window was too unsettling to ignore. As I double-checked the lock, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from my best friend. "Hey, everything okay? You've been quiet tonight." I stared at the message for a moment. Everything felt off, but I didn't want to worry her over something that might have been a simple mistake. I quickly typed out a reply, "Yeah, just tired. You know how it is." I put my phone down, the unease still clinging to me as I moved back to the couch. I kept glancing toward the window as if it might somehow open again. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but the back of my mind kept returning to that small, unsettling detail. The window wasn't just unlocked, it had been left that way somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else knew it was open, that they had been inside. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I slept fitfully, waking up multiple times to check the window again, making sure it was still secure. Each time I found it exactly as I left it, but the anxiety refused to fade. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was in the kitchen making coffee, that something else caught my eye. The window. It was open again. This time I was sure of it. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even thought about it. But there it was, cracked open once more, the latch once again undone. My stomach dropped, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed over to the window, locking it immediately and staring outside. There was no one in sight, nothing unusual in the yard. It was just a quiet, normal morning, but the dread that filled my chest told me otherwise. How could it be open again? I hadn't touched it since last night. I hadn't even considered opening it, and yet it was the same as before, open, unlocked, inviting something I couldn't see. I checked the rest of the house again, more thoroughly this time. The back door was still locked, the other windows as they should be. No sign of forced entry, nothing that could explain the open window. I sat down on the couch, my coffee forgotten, trying to rationalize what was happening. It had to be a mistake. Maybe I had opened it by accident. Maybe I had unlocked it without realizing it. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I wasn't alone in my house, I could feel it now. The window, like a silent invitation, had somehow become the door to something I couldn't explain. I couldn't bring myself to open it again. I couldn't even look at it without feeling that all too familiar sense of dread creeping up on me. That night, I made sure to double-check every lock in the house before I went to bed. I didn't sleep well, though. I lay awake, the sound of the wind outside more unsettling than it should have been. And when I woke up the next morning, I didn't even have to check the window. It was open again. Story 17. I had just returned from a long, exhausting day at work and was craving something simple. Pizza was the obvious choice. I didn't want to cook, and I didn't feel like doing anything too complicated. I'd ordered from the usual place, the one I'd been getting pizza from for years. They knew my address, knew my preferences. I figured it was just another regular night. When the delivery arrived, I took the box from the driver with a small thank you, and he gave me the usual half smile. I didn't think much of it as I paid and tipped him, but as he turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The receipt, which had the usual price and order details, also had a message written in small, hurried handwriting at the bottom. "Be careful who you trust tonight." I stared at the words for a long moment, the sentence sinking into my mind. My fingers tightened around the receipt, and I couldn't shake the sense of unease creeping up my spine. Who would leave a message like that on a pizza receipt, and why? I looked out the window, expecting to see the delivery driver still hanging around outside, but he was already gone, the street outside quiet as usual. I had no idea who would want to send me a message like that, And even though the rational part of me told me to just forget about it, the feeling that something was off wouldn't let me go. I made my way inside, locked the door behind me, and set the pizza down on the kitchen counter. I was trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of anxiety that had taken hold, but I couldn't stop thinking about the words on that receipt. It wasn't a coincidence, I thought. Someone had left that message for a reason, and they had to know something about me. Maybe I was overthinking it. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was probably just a weird prank. But deep down, I couldn't stop wondering if there was something I should be worried about. I tried to distract myself as I ate, but it was impossible to ignore the rising tension in the back of my mind. The message kept replaying in my head. Be careful who you trust tonight. What did that mean? Was it referring to someone I knew, someone I'd be meeting with later? I didn't have any major plans, but I did have a few things on my calendar: a meeting, a phone call, a friend coming over. Any one of those could have been what the note referred to. But why would someone, a stranger, send me a warning like that? I decided to ignore it, telling myself it was just a fluke, that I shouldn't overthink it. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I kept glancing at my phone, checking for messages, even though nothing seemed abnormal. As night crept in, the air in the apartment felt heavier. The usual quiet that I found comforting now felt oppressive. Every little sound seemed to amplify: cars passing by, the door closing in the hallway, the sound of my own breathing. I couldn't help it. I kept checking the locks on the door, checking the window, feeling as if someone were watching me from outside, waiting for the right moment. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the words from the receipt echoed in my mind. I finally decided to call it a night, trying to push the unease to the back of my mind. I settled into bed, pulling the covers up, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about that message. Was it a threat? A warning? Who had left it? And why? Around midnight, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I froze, staring at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The message was simple: I hope you took my advice. My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen. What the hell was going on? I didn't recognize the number, and there were no other words, no explanation, just that one unsettling sentence. I quickly locked my phone and sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know who was messing with me, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't being paranoid anymore. Something was wrong. The message on the receipt, the text now, this wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew something. Someone was watching. I got up and checked all the windows and doors again, making sure everything was locked and secure. I even moved the furniture in front of the back door, just in case. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just letting my mind run wild, but the feeling wouldn't go away. And with every passing minute, it felt like the world outside my apartment was closing in on me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any sound, waiting for something to happen. And as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever was behind this was waiting for the right moment to make their next move. By morning, I was exhausted, but the unease lingered, thicker than ever. I had no answers, no explanation for what had happened. But I knew one thing: whatever was going on, it wasn't over. Story 18. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where time seems to move slower, and the usual hum of the office was subdued. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the desk. I sat in my chair, eyes scanning the screen, trying to finish a report that had been hanging over my head all week. The sound of my keyboard tapping filled the room, a soft rhythm that seemed almost too loud in the silence. I leaned back, stretching my arms over my head, trying to loosen the tension in my shoulders. My eyes darted to the drawer on the left side of my desk. It was where I kept all the small, random items that didn't belong anywhere else: papers, old receipts, pens, and a few personal things I didn't want cluttering the surface. The pen I always used, a simple black ballpoint, was tucked inside. It had been there for weeks, its ink nearly gone, but I had grown used to it. It was a small comfort, a routine I didn't think about much. But today, as I pulled open the drawer to grab the pen, I noticed something odd. The pen I had left there was gone. In its place was a new one, sleek and black, with a metal clip that gleamed under the light. My first thought was that maybe I had misplaced the old one, but then something caught my eye. The new pen was engraved. It wasn't just any engraving. It was my initials, JH, carefully etched into the side of the pen in delicate script. I froze for a moment, my fingers still resting on the smooth surface. How was this possible? I hadn't bought a new pen, and I certainly hadn't ordered one with my initials. The pen I had left there was just a cheap, disposable one I had picked up from a local store. Nothing special. Yet here was this sleek, personalized pen placed in the exact spot where my old one had been. I took the pen in my hand, running my thumb over the engraving. The metal felt cool, almost too perfect in contrast to the mundane pen I had owned. I checked the drawer again, hoping the original pen would somehow reappear, but it was gone. I pulled out all the papers, shuffled through the clutter, but there was nothing. Just the engraved pen, as if it had always belonged there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had left it for me as a gift, though no one had mentioned anything about it. I couldn't recall anyone giving me a pen recently, and even if they had, why would it be in my drawer? My coworkers didn't even know where I kept my pens. There was no reason for someone to place this particular pen in my space. I stood up, pacing the small confines of my office, trying to think of any logical explanation. My mind was racing. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe the pen had been left by someone else by accident, or maybe it had been a simple mix-up. But everything about the situation felt wrong. The engraving, my initials, seemed intentional, as though someone knew exactly what they were doing. I sat back down at my desk, unable to tear my eyes away from the pen. It sat there, silent, waiting for me to make sense of it. My thoughts turned to the past few days. Nothing unusual had happened, or at least nothing that stood out. I hadn't had any visitors in my office, and there hadn't been any deliveries that would explain a personalized pen appearing out of nowhere. I shook my head, frustrated with myself for overthinking it. I needed to focus, to get back to work. I picked up the pen, clicked it a few times, and started jotting down some notes on the report I had been putting off. But the pen didn't feel right. The smooth surface, the way the ink flowed effortlessly, it was almost too smooth, too precise. It felt different from anything I had used before. I paused mid-sentence, staring at the ink on the paper. It was as if the pen was urging me to pay attention to it, to wonder about it. I set it down again and pushed it to the edge of the desk, hoping that would ease the strange feeling creeping up my spine. But as I tried to refocus on the report, I found myself distracted, my mind constantly drifting back to the pen. I couldn't shake the thought that something was off. The longer I stared at it, the more it felt like it was out of place, like it didn't belong in my life at all. I got up once more, pacing again, this time toward the window. I opened it slightly to get some fresh air, hoping it would clear my head. But as I stood there, looking out at the quiet street below, I noticed something strange. A reflection in the glass caught my eye. It wasn't my own face I saw, but the pen. It was resting on my desk, almost perfectly centered in the reflection, its engraving clearly visible. I stared at it, heart beginning to race. The angle of the reflection seemed too precise, too calculated, like someone had arranged it for me to see. I turned away from the window, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. There was no way this could be a coincidence. My phone buzzed, breaking my train of thought. I grabbed it quickly, hoping for a distraction. The message was from an unknown number. Hesitantly, I opened it. The message was simple, just a single line of text: "Did you like the pen?" I felt the blood drain from my face. My fingers trembled as I held the phone in my hands. There was no way anyone could have known about the pen, at least not without being in my office. I didn't recognize the number, and I hadn't given my contact information to anyone recently. I texted back, trying to keep my voice steady, though my pulse was hammering in my ears. "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly: "You know who I am." My stomach twisted in knots. I stood there frozen, staring at the screen, unable to move. A cold sweat started to form on the back of my neck. I glanced over at the desk again, the pen still sitting there, its engraving now seeming almost like a taunt. A reminder, a message. I didn't know who was behind this, but it was clear that someone had been in my office, someone who knew personal details about me, someone who had been watching me closely enough to leave a pen with my initials on it and send me a message. I dropped the phone onto the desk and grabbed my coat. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I reached for the door, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze again, my hand hovering just above the doorknob. For a split second, I thought I saw something, just a shadow in the corner of the room, near the file cabinet. It moved, barely noticeable, but enough to make my heart stop. I stood there, breathing heavily, listening to the silence. Nothing, just the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. I slowly turned the knob and stepped out into the hallway, still feeling the weight of the pen's mystery hanging over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for me to unravel whatever this was. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. The pen was only the beginning. Story 19. I was on my usual train ride home, the hum of the rails a familiar comfort as I gazed out the window, watching the city pass by. It had been a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home, relax, and forget about the stresses of the day. The train wasn't crowded, just a few people scattered around, absorbed in their phones, reading books, or lost in their own thoughts. I found my usual seat by the window, plugged in my headphones, and zoned out, letting the music drown out the sounds around me. But then I heard it. A soft voice, barely above a whisper, coming from behind me. "Don't get off at your stop." I froze. The words were so quiet, so gentle, I almost thought I imagined them. I pulled my headphones out, trying to focus, to figure out if I had really heard what I thought I had. The train was moving steadily, people still absorbed in their own world, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But that voice, it lingered in my mind. I turned slightly in my seat, scanning the space around me. Nothing. Just the same faces, the same empty seats. There was no one who appeared to be speaking to me. My heart began to beat a little faster as the words repeated in my mind. "Don't get off at your stop." I brushed it off, thinking it was some strange coincidence, maybe a misheard word, or the sounds of someone talking to themselves. I went back to looking out the window, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, and much closer. "Don't get off at your stop." I whipped my head around, scanning the area once more. There, sitting in the seat directly across from me, was a man. He looked unremarkable average height, wearing a nondescript jacket, his face slightly hidden by the hood he wore. But there was something about the way he was looking at me. His eyes met mine for a split second, and I felt a chill run through me. There was an intensity in his gaze, a knowing look that sent a wave of unease washing over me. Before I could react or say anything, he lowered his eyes and went back to his phone, as if nothing had happened. I stared at him for a moment, my pulse quickening, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Could he have been talking to me? Maybe he just happened to be speaking under his breath, and I misunderstood. The train began to slow as it approached my stop. I gathered my things, instinctively standing up and making my way toward the door. But as I stood there, my hand on the handle, I hesitated. The words from the stranger echoed in my mind, and I suddenly felt uncertain, unsure if I should get off. My stomach tightened with an unfamiliar sense of dread. I glanced over at the man who was still staring at his phone, seemingly oblivious to everything around him. I had no reason to think anything was wrong, no logical reason to stop myself from getting off at my stop. But the feeling in my gut was too strong to ignore. I let the train slow further, the doors opening with a soft hiss. The man glanced up at me, his eyes locking with mine once more. This time there was something more in his gaze, something urgent, almost pleading. I could have sworn he mouthed the words again, but this time they weren't just a whisper. They were clear, almost desperate. "Don't get off at your stop." My hand was still on the door handle, but now my mind was racing. Was this some kind of warning? Or was it just a random, strange encounter? It felt too deliberate, too specific to be just coincidence. The voice inside my head told me to stay on the train, to ignore the stop I had been getting off at for years. But my feet felt frozen to the floor, and my body refused to move. The doors remained open for a few moments longer, and I could hear the sound of footsteps in the distance, echoing on the platform. I looked out the door, my eyes scanning the station. Everything looked normal, just the usual crowd of people heading home, no one seeming out of place. The train was still at a standstill, waiting to move again. I couldn't explain it, but something deep inside me told me not to step off, not to get off at this stop. It wasn't a fear of missing my stop, or a fear of being late. It was something far more primal, an instinct that made me hold my breath, my whole body tense. I looked at the man once again, this time taking a mental note of his features. He had dark hair, a stubbled jaw, and a tired expression, but his eyes were focused entirely on me now. There was no hint of a smile, no warmth in his face, just an eerie kind of calm that unsettled me even further. I decided, with a sudden rush of resolve, to stay. I stepped back from the door and sat down again, my mind racing. The train doors closed with a soft thud, and the train jerked forward, resuming its journey. My heart thudded in my chest as I felt the weight of the man's warning settle over me. I sat there, still unsure if I had made the right decision, or if I was just overthinking it. But as the train continued on, I kept looking back, checking the people around me, trying to shake the feeling that something had just been averted. When I arrived at my usual stop, I decided to get off, albeit with a lingering sense of unease. As I stepped out onto the platform, I noticed a commotion in the distance. A small crowd gathered near the entrance to the station, a few police cars parked nearby. I couldn't see the exact details, but there was something unsettling about the scene. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts clouding my mind. Maybe I had been right to stay on the train. Maybe my gut instinct had saved me from something I couldn't even understand. But I couldn't shake the image of that stranger's eyes the way he had looked at me, his words repeating in my head. "Don't get off at your stop." I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that I had listened. Something told me that getting off at that stop would have been a mistake. Story 20. And I had just finished a long day at work and was finally heading home. The sun had just begun to set, casting a soft golden glow over the horizon. The drive was peaceful, the road empty and quiet, and I welcomed the solitude. I always enjoyed these late drives, the calm before the chaos of the evening began. As I cruised down the highway, I leaned back in my seat, enjoying the rhythm of the road. But then, without warning, the windshield wipers started moving. It was jarring at first. They flicked on at full speed, the blades swiping across the windshield in rapid, uneven movements. I blinked, confused. The sky was clear, not a cloud in sight, and there wasn't a raindrop in the air. My mind raced to figure out what was happening. Maybe the rain sensor was malfunctioning. I hadn't noticed any mist or drizzle on the glass, but I quickly hit the wiper control to turn them off. Nothing happened. I pressed the button again, harder this time, but the wipers continued to move back and forth, as if something was controlling them, something beyond my reach. My heart began to pound as I realized I had no idea why this was happening. There was no rain, no storm, not even a sign of bad weather. The wipers seemed to have a mind of their own. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that cars sometimes acted in strange ways, especially older models like mine. Maybe it was a glitch. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. I looked around, half expecting to see anything that could explain the strange behavior. But the road ahead remained empty, the night still and quiet. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The wipers were still moving erratically, and I had no choice but to sit there and watch them. It felt like I was in some kind of trance, as though something was controlling the car from a distance. I tried everything I could think of to make them stop. I turned the car off and then back on. I switched between different wiper settings. I even tried the windshield washer, but nothing worked. The wipers kept moving back and forth as if they were stuck in an endless loop. A cold chill settled over me, making me realize just how isolated I was. The highway was empty, and there was no one around to help. I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car pulling up behind me, but there was nothing. It felt as if I were the only person left in the world. Finally, in desperation, I reached over and manually tried to lift the wiper arm off the windshield. It was a struggle, but I finally managed to pull it up and out of place. As soon as I did, the wipers stopped. Silence filled the car. I sat there for a moment, my breath shaky, still processing what had just happened. There was no reason for the wipers to have turned on like that, no logical explanation. But as I looked out at the empty road, something in the back of my mind nagged at me. It wasn't just the wipers that had bothered me. It was the way they had kept going, even after I tried to stop them. It was as if something or someone wanted me to keep driving, wanted me to stay on this road. I took a deep breath and slowly put the car back in drive. The wipers were still in their lifted position, and the road stretched out ahead of me, dark and silent. I knew I should be more cautious, but the thought of getting out of the car, standing on the side of the road, didn't seem like a safe option. I just wanted to get home. As I pulled back onto the highway, I noticed something strange in the distance, a faint shadow moving across the road. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a person, or at least it looked like one, standing still in the middle of the road, just far enough ahead that I couldn't make out any details. I slowed down instinctively, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, in the middle of the highway. I wasn't sure whether to stop or keep going. The wipers, now back in their normal position, remained motionless, and the car seemed eerily quiet. The figure wasn't doing anything, it was just standing there like it was waiting. My gut told me something wasn't right, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I continued driving slowly, my eyes fixed on the figure. As I got closer, I could finally make out the shape of a person, though something about the way they stood didn't feel natural. They seemed almost too still, like a mannequin placed there for some kind of reason I couldn't comprehend. I was within 10 feet when the figure moved, but not in the way I expected. The figure snapped its head to face me, its eyes wide and unblinking, locked on my car. I swerved, almost losing control of the wheel, and my heart raced as I hurriedly turned the steering wheel, driving into the shoulder of the road. My mind was screaming, but my body was frozen in fear. The figure didn't chase me. It didn't move again. But as I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw it still standing there, watching me, unmoving. I sped away, not looking back again. The rest of the drive home passed in a blur, and I didn't stop until I pulled into my driveway, the car still shaking from the adrenaline. I sat there for a long time, just staring at my house. My hands were still trembling from the encounter. I couldn't explain what I had just seen, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. But the strange thing is, when I finally stepped out of the car and walked to the door, I noticed something else. The windshield wipers were back in their resting position, but there was something new. A faint smear across the windshield, right where the wipers had been, as if something had been watching me, waiting for me to get out. It was just a smear, but the way it glistened in the dim light, the way it almost seemed to be, looking back at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened that night, whatever was waiting for me, was far from over. Story 21. The photo album on my phone contained a picture of me asleep. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe I had accidentally taken a photo while fumbling with my phone, but that didn't make sense. The angle of the photo was too precise, too deliberate, and the lighting was too perfect for it to be a mistake. It was as if someone had been watching me and decided to snap a picture while I was completely unaware. I stared at the image, my heart pounding. I recognized the room immediately. It was my bedroom, but the bed looked different, slightly more disheveled than I remembered. I could see myself in the picture, lying on my side, my face peaceful in sleep, but there was something unsettling about the scene. It didn't feel like a moment I had lived. The way the sheets were arranged, the way the shadows fell across the room, it felt off. The image didn't match the memory of the room I had when I went to bed the previous night. I swiped through the other photos in the album, trying to find an explanation, but there were no other pictures that seemed out of place. Just that one. The photo was dated 2 days ago, but I had no memory of taking it. In fact, I couldn't remember anyone coming into my room at all. I lived alone, and no one had access to my phone. I checked my phone's camera roll history, looking for anything unusual, but everything else seemed normal. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was some kind of glitch, a random image that got stuck in my album from an old app or file. But that didn't explain why it felt so real, so vivid. The more I looked at the picture, the more I felt like it wasn't just a photo. It was a message, something hidden between the pixels, waiting for me to see it. I sat there for a while, staring at the photo, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I had been stressed lately. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized I couldn't. Something was wrong. I examined the picture more closely, zooming in on the edges. There, just out of the frame of the photo, I noticed someone. A figure, blurry but unmistakably human, standing just outside the door of my room. The shape was indistinct, but the presence was undeniable. My pulse quickened as I stared at the figure. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it. The presence of someone watching me. It was as if they were waiting for me to notice.